Good afternoon and welcome to our session, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, Accessible Spreadsheets. Our presenters today are Chrystal, Trapani, and Kristin White, faculty members at Old Dominion University. If you have any questions for our presenters during the session, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom room screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. On that note, I will hand it over to our presenters. And I do believe you all are on mute. We can't hear you.
Good morning. Oh, I guess it's good afternoon. Sorry. And I apologize. I am losing my voice. Today, Chrystal and I will be presenting on A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And I'm just going to do a quick introduction for Chrystal to get started. Chrystal is currently the accessibility architect with digital innovation at Old Dominion University and an adjunct instructor in the Department of English at ODU. A Google certified trainer and a doctoral graduate student at Old Dominion University in the Instructional Design and Technology program. Her research focuses on instructor attitudes towards digitally accessible course materials and basic writing courses. She is Instructors Educator of the Year, and she has also been honored with the Dell's College Course Award. Chrystal blends her experience working with first-generation and non-traditional students, curriculum development, creating interactive and accessible online course content, digital accessibility, and training faculty to help them achieve positive student outcomes and success. In working with faculty, she helps her colleagues gain strong working knowledge of how to make course content successful for students of all learning abilities.
Thanks, Kristin. And I am joined by Kristin White. She is the Instructional Technology Manager with Digital Innovation at Old Dominion University. She has been an integral part of ODU's transition to remote teaching and continues to develop and facilitate faculty support on topics including digital accessibility. She graduated from Indiana State University with her MS in Educational Technology. Kristin has noticed the absence of basic accessibility knowledge and strives to help others create content that is accessible for all. She has presented on digital accessibility many places, including the Virginia Society for Technology and Education, and we did a 5-part series for Hawks a couple years ago.
And today we're going to focus on two main objectives, but before I even get into that, throughout the presentation, you might hear us referring to spreadsheets and Excel. Unless something is specific to Excel, it's okay to assume that the directions we're providing apply to both Microsoft Excel and Google Sheets. Spreadsheets can do a lot of things. I'm pretty sure the meaning of the universe is in there somewhere. So please understand that we're just covering the basics during the workshop. And in reference to Excel, we're discussing the most current version of Excel, because in general, good accessibility starts with ensuring that you're using the most current version of the software. So today, the two objectives we are going to be focusing on is that by the end of this presentation, you should be able to appraise when it's appropriate to use a spreadsheet versus when you use something such as a word processing program. And you'll also be able to analyze the basic accessibility standards needed to make spreadsheets accessible. Before we dive into spreadsheets themselves, we're going to talk quickly about accessibility in general and who it impacts. So everyone should actually benefit from your course content. And there are 4 main types of accessibility issues when it comes to your digital content. The first is visibility. This is going to include those who have no vision or low vision. They might be using something such as a screen reader, high contrast settings, or magnifiers, and your document structure is really going to help these individuals. The second is audibility. This is including those who have low hearing or no hearing. Narration or video is often difficult for these individuals, and you want to make sure if you're using anything like that, that you are adding captions and subtitles to your recordings. If you're doing a presentation, such as we are today, if possible, having a sign language interpreter or at least live captions available should be included, as you will not know who in your audience may be hard of hearing or deaf. Then we have mobility, and there's 2 different types. There's physical mobility, which is like the loss of range of motion, and electronic mobility. And this is the ability to review documents across multiple devices and have them appear the same no matter where someone's looking at it. And lastly, we have cognition. That's the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. So when we think about accessibility, it's important to recognize that accessibility helps everyone. This table provides examples of situational and temporary circumstances where your students will benefit from accessible content, even though they may not have a permanent visual, motor, hearing, or cognitive disability. This all falls under the concept of the curb cut effect, which is where something intended to solve an access need ends up being used by a wider audience. So think about it in this respect. When you go to the grocery store, you generally walk through a set of automatic doors. And then when you go to leave, you generally will take your cart to the curb cut to get to your car. If you're watching a movie and you don't want to wake someone in the next room, you might watch it with the subtitles on. And if you've ever listened to an audiobook, that's how many people with disabilities read books. So you're using access, something provided for an access need, even though you don't have a permanent disability. So why do you need accessible content? One of the most common things we hear is, well, why do I need to do that? I don't have students with paperwork for accommodations. And while that might be the case right now, you may easily have a student later who does have accommodation paperwork. It's estimated that approximately 10% of people have a learning disability. And while that doesn't seem like a lot, it's effectively 1 in 10 individuals. So therefore, if you have a course capped at 30 students, the odds are that you have at least 3 students with some type of learning difference, even though they might not have paperwork. Getting accommodations can be really expensive. So odds are that you have students who will benefit from accommodations, but access to them is impossible for a gambit of reasons, including something such as financial barriers. A student or their family, caregiver, or guardian might think they don't need an accommodation. A common occurrence of this is people with colorblindness might not think they need an accommodation or can get an accommodation, but they're actually at a great disadvantage if your course content doesn't meet color contrast standards. Additionally, your students' caregivers might have accommodations. So if you're providing things in the digital realm and it's going to them as well, you should be thinking about that. As Corinne Gray, the CEO of Uncomfortable Revolution, says, if you embrace diversity but ignore disability, you're doing it wrong. In order to be fully diverse, you have to accept individuals with disabilities also. Accessible course content is required under federal law, and many schools have been sued for non-compliance. Don't become a statistic. The moment you put something in a digital space, such as email or an LMS like Blackboard or Canvas, or if you put it into Google Drive, it must meet web accessibility standards. And if it doesn't, you're actually opening yourself up to litigation. Accessibility compliance is like speeding. Ignorance of the law or the speed limit won't help you out. Section 508 requires institutions to provide accessible content to students of all learning abilities. It aims to make websites, web apps, electronic documents, and software accessible to everyone. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.0, level A and AA, are explicitly referenced in the refreshed Section 508. Finally, it's just common courtesy. If you see somebody struggling to open a door because their hands are full, you're probably going to feel inclined to hold the door open for them. So you should think about accessibility in that sense. Many people have bias against disabled individuals. That's why there are laws and federal policies against discrimination. However, if you find yourself thinking this way, take a moment and ask yourself, how would you feel if someone said you weren't capable of a task because of your gender, race, religion, hair color, right or left-handed, etc.? You would probably be pretty upset. As a child, or even now as an adult, you often have the opportunity to try things out. Maybe you've tried a new hobby or thought about starting a new career. Hopefully you were able to try these things out without barriers. If you found you didn't have the capability or just didn't like something you tried, you had the opportunity to move on and choose another path. When you tell someone they can't do something because they are disabled, you are removing the path for them to try. You cannot place limitations on someone who is disabled. Let them decide what they can or can't do, or what path they can take or want to try to take, just as you did for yourself. Someone most certainly can do a job that works heavily with spreadsheets, such as accounting, if they're blind. Someone who has a mobility issue can only use a keyboard to navigate the screen can work with spreadsheets. Someone who's dyslexic can major in English or math. Odds are that someone who is living the experience of the disability has a better idea as to what their limitations are versus what you imagine their limitations to be. Inversely, if you hear a colleague talking this way, call them out on it. And now let's think about when we should actually use spreadsheets. Odds are, if you are a spreadsheet guru, you've bemoaned people using spreadsheets for things they really aren't intended to do. Good accessibility starts with using the correct tool for the job. Often there are individuals using spreadsheets when they should be using something such as a word processing program or the other way around. Not only does this make achieving accessibility incredibly important, but it also takes more time to generate the document. Spreadsheet programs such as Microsoft Excel and Google Sheets are used to record and maintain data in tables. These programs are optimized for data analysis, writing simple and complex formulas to perform calculations on data and present the data in charts. Spreadsheets should be used when you require flat or non-relational views of data when your data is mostly numeric, frequently run calculations and statistical comparison on data, use pivot table reports to view data, plan to create charts regularly with a constantly changing data set, perform what-if analysis operations on data such as statistics, engineering, and regression analysis. Whereas word processing programs such as Microsoft Word and Google Docs are generally used to create simple and complex text-based documents. Ultimately, spreadsheets are focused on aggregating and presenting data points. If you're filling spreadsheets with things that are not data, such as paragraphs, you are not using the correct program. Users often make more work for themselves by using the incorrect technology to complete a task, not to mention the lack of accessibility. With the updates to technology, it's often more work and generates a less professional final document to make your content inaccessible than accessible. As we go through this presentation, we hope you'll appreciate and realize that most of the things we're going to talk about will help everyone be more productive and efficient.
All right, and we're going to talk about some style and appearance and things first. And the first one being contrast, or as it's more specifically known as color contrast. And if you've ever had that moment where you're doing laundry and you struggle to match a pair of black and navy blue socks and you just needed better light to tell the difference, so you went to the window or you went to the light. Imagine not being able to get that better light to tell what the color something is. Someone who experiences a form of color blindness is going to see the world very differently from you. A student who has low vision or no vision, they might override the colors in your document. Students who have processing disorders might also override your color combinations to help them focus. But color contrast is the difference between the background color and the foreground color. And so your background color is the color of the page. So if you open a new spreadsheet, a new Google Doc, what have you, it's a white background with black font. So that's your foreground color. But contrast is often expressed as a ratio that ranges from 1 to 21, and it's written as 1:1, which is white text on white background, which no one can read, and 21:1, which is black text on white background. The first number in the ratio refers to the relative luminance of light colors, and the second number refers to the relative luminance of dark colors. And I'm going to give you a tool in just a minute that'll do all this math for you, so don't worry about, oh, she's going to give me all that stuff. WCAG 2.0 AA guidelines, which if you're at an institution receiving federal funding, which since this is an education conference, probably everybody on this call, are required to meet a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for the visual presentation of both text and images. And it's important to know that 4.5 can't be rounded, so 4.45 doesn't cut it. You got to have 4.5. WCAG 2.0 AAA guidelines require a minimum contrast of ratio of 7 to 1. And so it's just important to think about, people are going to perceive your colors very differently. And there's a lot of information in a very compact space when you're looking at a spreadsheet. And when you're considering contrast, navigating your course content gets a lot more difficult if those standards aren't met. And while the colors might look fine to you, they might be impossible for someone who has color blindness. And we're going to look at some examples of kind of charts and looking at them together. So on this slide, I have two different bar charts. The one on the left has dark blue and light blue lines, and it is seen as someone who has a normal field of vision. And if you're saying to yourself, wait, I do not see two blue lines there, you might have color blindness. But I ran the same chart through a color blindness simulator on the right. And if I told you, okay, from your homework, I want you to extrapolate the data from the dark blue line, you're looking at a slide that's got a kind of a green and a kind of a periwinkle. There is no dark blue line if you have that form of color blindness. So you're going to have a really hard time completing your assignment. And it's important to know that colors are identified in several ways depending on the program someone's using. And while it's not important to understand the complexities of how the computer spits out these numbers to you, it is important to know which one you're looking at. So when you go to put it in the tool I'm going to give you, you can go, oh, that's this one. Colors are presented in one of three ways. RGB, which is the amount of red, green, and blue that generates a color. This is presented in a series of 3 numbers. Hexadecimal or hex presents colors in a combination of 6 letters and numbers. When a color is presented in a hex format, it starts with a hash and is followed by the characters. And then finally, HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. And this is related to how people perceive colors. And it's a series of 3 different numbers, couple percentages, and a degree. And so, like I said, while you don't need to know how they spits them out, you just need to know, hey, this is that. Because there's the tool I'm going to show you. And so here's some kind of examples of all that information together. The first one, that first box, is pure red on white, and that meets 4.1 to 1, or 4 to 1. So that's WCAG single eye, so it wouldn't meet our double eye. Pure blue, which is the middle box, that exceeds that ratio. And it has a ratio of 8.6 to 1. And then that bottom box, that kind of neon green that imagine most people are struggling with, is a contrast ratio of 1.4 to 1. And so while it's not important to know where it came from, it is important to think about that. And the tools I'm going to give you to do that, to do it for you, is I'm going to start with WebAIM. So WebAIM, what this does, it's free. We all like free. You can put your color information in these boxes and it will give you the contrast ratio. So I'm going to put in a number, that's a hex. But if I had RGB, it will also let me add the RGB or the HSL. And it gives me that ratio, so 13.45 to 1. But let's, for the sake of example, let's say that was what I put in and it doesn't match. I can slide the little slider bar and it will tell me, there we go, I got a match, and it gives me the information to take back to my document. And so let's look at this chart for example for a minute. So let's say this is a chart you've given your students. You're like, okay, students, I want you to, give me a write-up about this data. It's your homework. But let me show you what this chart looks like. So you're the student, you're trying to interpret this data. These lines are all kind of smushed and pretty hard to read together as is. But what if I start applying colorblindness filters to it? Suddenly it gets a lot harder. Let's say that is your field of vision. You can't extrapolate that data at all. But it gets very difficult very quickly to kind of go through and interpret any of the data out of that graph. But the best practice, because it is always easier and quicker to build accessibly than have to remediate, a best practice is to make and identify an accessible color palette before you start. I'm going to show you a tool that does that in a minute. And this is going to let you make sure your document meets accessibility standards as you're going. You're not going to have to go back and fix it. And the tool I'm going to show you is called Color Safe. And I can say get started. Let's say I've got a color in mind. Maybe you want to use your institutional's colors. You're going to pick a font, pick something similar to what you normally use. I use Georgia a lot. And then for font size, this one's important. You're going to put in size 17. And the reason for that is WCAG, or not WCAG, your 508 standards differentiate between size 18 and smaller and 18 and larger. And it's just easier to just say, okay, I'm just going to have it all meet the same standard. And the standard, the numbers for smaller text is a little more stringent. That way you're not trying to remember, okay, if it's this size, I can do this, and this size, I can do that. 17 is easy to remember. I can hit generate color palette, and it's going to give me every color that meets contrast standards with the color I put in. Now, it's important to note, meet does not mean match. Like if I pick out and go into these, the color I put in was kind of a navy blue. I am probably never going to put pink with that navy blue. So just keep that in mind. But let's say I did want that pink. It gives me the hex code or the RGB for me to take back to my document. But colors often used in spreadsheets to help users quickly ascertain important data. Have you ever considered how somebody with color blindness, low vision, no vision, or processing disorders is viewing your document? By the nature of spreadsheets, there's going to be times you have to use color to convey meaning, and we get that. We're not saying don't use color. We know that's an important part of spreadsheets sometimes. But there's some steps you need to take to ensure that everybody can successfully interpret that data. If you want to use colors, like I said, certainly we don't want you to not use colors. You just want to make sure you have a text alternative. So for example, if I'm looking at this this data set here, I've got a table showing me a list of animals and their preferred diet. But do you know what belongs in those color boxes? Imagine you have a new colleague in the office, maybe they're not even colorblind, and you hand them this and you're like, okay, this is what you need to do this. They might have no idea what they're looking at. You would have a hard time completing that. But if I take that same data set and I just add into it what those words mean, what those colors mean, suddenly everybody's working more efficiently. What if I've got a chart? I've got this, I've been provided this chart. I'm supposed to determine how many animals each student found in total. But if I'm colorblind and all I see are gray bars, that's going to be a hard kind of go through to handle. But what if I went through and I just added the numbers to each bar? It's just little tweaks that make things more efficient for everybody.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about built-in formatting and cell styles within spreadsheets. So in Word and PowerPoint documents, we generally stress the importance of using built-in styles because it helps to make your documents more accessible. However, there's a little bit of a twist on that in Excel. When you apply a cell style, it doesn't automatically apply a header row like you might find in a table. This is entirely a visual effect. Most screen readers cannot identify the font formatting in Excel, such as bold, so you should not rely on the formatting to distinguish it from other cells. This cell isn't recognized as a table header, and if you export the spreadsheet to a PDF, it's not tagged as a table header. Some of the suggested color combinations as well that are shown on this slide do not meet color contrast standards. So the built-in formatting is not going to ensure that you're using a correct or a sufficient color contrast when you are applying them. So the next is thinking about your fonts. This is similar to any of your other, documents that you're creating. And there is a debate in the disability community about whether or not serif or sans serif fonts are better. There's really no consensus. So because of that, when you're selecting a font to use, you need to be cognizant of multiple things. If you're not familiar with what the difference is between fonts, serifs are the decorative tails or strokes that stem from the letters. If something is sans serif, it does not have those tails. Sans serifs are slightly more readable than serif fonts in many cases. You want to make sure that there is a clear distinction between the letters when you are selecting your fonts. So for example, Arial is technically considered accessible, but it is hard for some individuals to read it as letters like lowercase l and uppercase I are difficult to differentiate. There is not a best typeface or font. Some people believe that sans serif is better for screen reading, while others feel that serifs, or the ones with tails, are better for print reading. Either way, you should aim for simplicity in your font for the most readability. When choosing a font, you should use similar, familiar parsed fonts. You should avoid complex characters such as cursive scripts, especially in spreadsheets. You should avoid ambiguous characters such as where a letter like O and the number 0 are similar, or the letter C is nearly closed and looks very similar to the letter O. You also want to limit the number of fonts that you are using because every person, when they're reading, every time you swap a font, they have to adjust their reading pattern. You want to consider the spacing and weight of your fonts. Fonts that have little spacing between letters are hard to read. So sometimes like a word like cool, C-O-O-L, may look like the word cod, C-O-D, if the letters are too close. Additionally, fonts that are very light can be difficult to read. You need to think about the color contrast of the font and the background, and you need to avoid small size fonts. Additionally, you want to think about the formatting within your cells. You should avoid all caps whenever possible because many screen readers will actually read the caps as individual letters versus reading the words, which will make it inaccessible. If you are going to use abbreviations, you have to think or take into account that when an abbreviation is used, it might not be distinguishable to someone who is using something such as a screen reader. So if you have the word September and you're abbreviating it to SEPT period, it will be read as SEPT by a screen reader. For acronyms, you must provide the full spelling of the acronym prior to using just the acronym in your document. Excuse me. For example, if you're going to use the FBI acronym, you want to say Federal Bureau of Investigation, parentheses, FBI, before just using FBI later in your document. Special characters are not often read by screen readers. Only certain ones are, and it differs from screen reader to screen reader. You should never use this special character in place of something like a bullet, and hopefully you're not using bullets in your spreadsheets. Underlines should only be used for URLs, and this is going to help users with color blindness or low vision because they might have trouble distinguishing links from regular text without the underline. Additionally, in general, now we all kind of assume that something underlined is hyperlinked to something else. So it helps all users in that case. And again, color. The color alone should never be used as the only indicator, as Chrystal pointed out, and that's not just with the color of the cells, it's also the color of the font. If someone has color blindness or low vision, they will not be able to ascertain the information. And the next slide just has some examples of different types of serif and sans serif fonts. This is not all encompassing, but these are just some general suggestions for serif and sans serif fonts. And now let's talk about font style and size. When you're selecting a font to go in your spreadsheet, readability is more important than ever. Not only do you have a lot of information all in one place, but it's also surrounded by boxes. It's a lot of visual information to take in all at once for everyone. You can use a serif or sans serif font, but you need to ensure it is extremely legible. While you are okay to pick a slightly more decorative font in a word processing document or a presentation document, you need to select a simplistic font for spreadsheets. The absolute minimum size you should use in your spreadsheet is 11 points. When selecting the best font size, you need to also keep in mind that if you make the font too large, it can impact navigation. Users can zoom in and out on content as they need. When thinking about formatting your text, most screen readers will not announce things like capitalization, sorry, bold, italics, underlines, and strike through. I apologize. So it's critical, just as you did for color, to make sure you're explaining this information in a way. Chrystal, I think I need you to take a look for a second.
Yep.
Sorry.
So you want to think about that information in a way that is going to explain it for everybody. So you think about text, most screen readers aren't going to announce that capitalization, the bold, italics, and underlines. So you just want to make sure it's there in some sort of way that's meaningful for somebody who's viewing your spreadsheet. And the text in your cell cannot be cropped. If it overflows, you need to adjust the cell size or adjust for wrap text. A screen reader will actually announce every instance of cropped or overflowing text if you don't change the formatting. So imagine for a second if you've got a spreadsheet that's got 1,000 lines in it and every one is cropped. That would be incredibly painful for you just to get through. And so we're going to look at some structure and semantics things. And so the first one is data flow. And there are some limitations for assistive technology to consider when generating a spreadsheet. In word processing documents, users have the ability to tell the screen reader to just read the whole document start to finish, but that does not exist in spreadsheets. And so with this in mind, you want to make sure your workbook is set up in a logical order, and that's really going to help everybody go through your document anyways. You should use unique, clear, concise naming conventions. A worksheet's name needs to be unique and no more than about 20 to 30 characters long. The accessibility police aren't going to show up if it's 31 characters, but you do want to try to keep it short. You should avoid leaving blank rows, columns, and cells and worksheets. A screen reader user might think, oh, I've come to the end of this worksheet. And it just, it might not be that they've come to the end of the worksheet. It was that you skipped 20 lines and came down. But also think about how that impacts your workflow also. It's going to get very time consuming to skip through several blank cells. If you need to separate multiple tables in one worksheet, leave one blank row between tables. If you have cells that you've intentionally left blank, they should be marked as such with like no data or NA. And you can make that text the same color as the background if you want. So if you wanted to do white text on white background, just so you have that blank cell there, that's still it's just gonna announce it to your somebody who's using assistive technology. That's fine if you want to do that, because you're just, it's for a visual kind of thing. It is important to remember that it should be words that screen readers won't read, those special characters such as like 2 marked dashes. You want to try to avoid hidden rows and columns whenever possible. But if you must use a hidden row or column, you have to accompany it with an alert using the pop-up note function. And it just lets the reader know it's there. And that again is another thing that's going to help everybody. If you don't realize that that hidden row is there, you might not check for it. And so A1, you've probably never thought twice about A1, that top left cell in your spreadsheet, that very first one, but it is so critical for individuals using assistive technologies. A1 provides the orientating information in the worksheet or the workbook, and it lets users know the number of sheets in the workbook, the title of the table that begins below it. For larger complex workbooks, it includes a general description of the workbook and navigation instructions. And so I've got here, this is a bar chart. It's kind of got that same bar chart from earlier, but this is an example of appropriately using that A1. I've come in here, I'm like, this worksheet contains a bar graph that shows how many of each type of animal a student found, the number of omnivores, carnivores, and herbivores. Ours is followed, and I've split them out. But that's going to let anybody kind of very quickly go, what was this about, and move on. And then tables and visuals have some kind of their own specific details that have to be thought about. And when you create a table, the title of the table should be directly above it. This can be accomplished by using the insert table or format as table function. You must provide a header row, column, or both, as this information provides screen reader users with the orientating information. If you're using data, you can select my table has headers during the creation progress. And if your table has a header column, either in addition to or instead of the header row, you want to check first column on the design tab on the ribbon. If you're starting without data, you can leave my table has headers unchecked, and Excel is going to automatically create a header row for you with names like column 1, column 2, column 3. And that's fine. You just have to make sure you update that as you progress through the generating of your document, which you would probably be doing anyways. You're again welcome to use that color in your table to help sighted individuals use the interpret the data. Just make sure you're meeting contrast. And if they are critical, those colors are critical for the data, you have to have a text alternative. And finally, you can't merge cells. Merge cells are very confusing for screen reader users to navigate because the screen reader itself expects one cell per piece of data. And for table identification and placement, clarity is important above all else when creating a table in a spreadsheet. And let's be honest, most of us have seen a spreadsheet that clarity needed to happen for everybody. And so there are some things you want to keep in mind. You want to make sure you have a title. Each table should have a clear and succinct title that includes the number of the table, even if it's just table 1, displayed directly above the table. The table name must also be placed in the design on the tab on the ribbon. In that design tab, it won't let you have spaces between, like if you have 3 words. So you can use camel case or underscores in that box, and the screen reader is going to read it as the proper title. Camel case is when you capitalize the first letter of each word. And if you are somebody who does hashtags on social media a lot, camel case is what you should use within your hashtags for the same reason. It's going to tell the screen reader, I want this word read like this. And those titles again are going to help all users out. So for an example, that table name on the design tab might be animals on Wednesday, all one word smushed all together, with the camel case, or animals _on Wednesday. And then the table name would be table 1, animals on Wednesday. And again, this just helps all users. Imagine if there's 20 tables in your workbook and each one was simply table and a number. Everybody's going to benefit from that adjustment. Wrap text, just like information not in the table, you need to wrap the text so it's not cut off or overflowing into the adjacent cells. The span information is helpful to have placed in the same cell as the title cell. This way the screen reader user knows where the title ends and begins. You can make this white text on the white background so it's hidden from sighted users if you'd like, but it will still announce that information to someone using a screen reader because the screen reader doesn't care what color you use. Again, you want to try for one table per worksheet. We know there's times you're going to have more than one, and that does happen. We get that, but it's just going to help everybody review your information more efficiently. It's easier for someone to navigate if they're using a screen reader. But also if you do have to put two tables in a worksheet, you should place them one above the other, starting in column A versus side by side, with a single blank row between them. And finally, if your table is complex in nature, you need to break it up into simple tables. This helps everyone access your data. And when you make a large, complicated table, you'll often find yourself having to explain how to interpret the data to everybody who uses that information, or they'll just interpret it incorrectly and then you're gonna have to go back and redo work anyways. And so this is really gonna help everybody who interacts with that data just be more efficient. Okay. And so when you're inputting a graph or chart, you want to make sure you're fully labeling them, including the title, the legend, axis labels, and data labels. A screen reader is only going to announce the basic information. They can't provide detailed description of what the graph displays. Also, color blindness is going to impact that user's ability to interpret that data. It's a good way to not rely on color alone is like with dotted lines versus solid lines or hash lines. You need to also include a complete description in the text, plain text directly in the cell and not in the alt text section. Ironically, in Excel, the alt text for images, objects, charts, and graphs is not automatically read by screen readers. If it's a single graph, you can put this information in A1. If there's multiple graphs, you can put that summary in A1 and then identify the cell description of where each graph is located. And so again, we've got that proper use of A1. Kristin, are you good to take over? She says yes.
Say yes. Let's see if I can make it. Okay, so we have like two quick things and we're not going to go into great detail on them. But if you're using spreadsheets as forms, just like anything else, make sure you're providing clear orienting information in A1. You should also provide instructions for navigating and completing your form. Your form should be simple and straightforward. A good format is to place your questions in the left column and your input fields in the column to the right. Each input field must have a label or instructions visible on the screen, and they should be adjacent to the cell containing the question or description. Your input cells should be shaded to make them more visually discernible. And you can use any color that meets contrast standards except yellow, because yellow is the color that is the input message. You want to make sure that your input messages are being used to guide users in filling out the form correctly. With this, you also want to use validation criteria. Overall, your alert should be detailed, specific, and clear, and should be used within forms. If a field is required, you must identify this and alert your users in A1. Form controls such as checkboxes, option boxes, spin buttons, and scroll bars, ActiveX controls actually are floating above the cell layer. So overall, these are inaccessible and they usually cannot be accessed via keyboard navigation. And this is an example of when you should ask yourself if you're using the correct technology to complete a task. In cases like this, you might want to use a Google form or a Microsoft form to better suit your needs. Within the form, you should also lock all the cells except for the input cells. So this prevents someone from accidentally modifying or deleting information in your form. And last but not least, just keep in mind that there are accessibility checkers. However, they are going to have some limitations, right? So use them more like a polishing tool. You don't want to use that as your starting point. You should see the accessibility checker, something like spell check. If you're relying on the accessibility checker, you're likely missing things because it's just a tool, and just like every other tool, you have to know how to use it and how it's supposed to function, because it could tell you that there's an accessibility error, but if you don't understand the error, you're not going to know how to fix it per se. Even with that, you should still run an accessibility checker to check behind you. Even the most well-intentioned individual may miss something when creating a document. So Microsoft does have a built-in tool, and one thing that I will say, if you're using Google Sheets, is that it does have an add-on, but it does cost some money. It's not horrible. It's like, I think like $700 maybe now for a whole domain. But it is something you have to purchase in order to have that accessibility checker behind you. But it does help to take the guesswork out of some of those pieces. So we will open up for questions, and I'm
gonna start with going back to the title slide, because somebody wanted the bit.ly. Give me back to point, and I'm gonna put that in the chat. Respond to them too.
Thank you, Chrystal. I was waiting until we had the question and answer time for that question about the Greek letters. Yeah, the Greek letters, I was looking, it looks like it, like Chrystal said, it should. But
it should, because it makes up a language.
Yeah.
But I grabbed DQ is a really great resource. It does cost money if you want to take their courses, but they are a really great resource on accessibility information. So that's a pretty trustworthy link I grabbed and put in the chat about what's generally read and what's not read. Unfortunately, not all screen readers are created equally. And some will read more than others. And it is partially like if you're reading, or if you're using NVDA, which is free, it's not going to read as much as those ones that you pay for.
Yeah. Any other questions? And we do have a lot of in the slide notes, just so you know, because like there was no way we had time to show you how to do all these things. We do have resources about what we talked about. Additionally, there were resources for the WebAIM, as well as the color safe that Chrystal showed earlier as well.
Yeah, I definitely suggest grabbing. I put it in the Q&A. Let me drag over the one I don't have in presentation mode. We have on all the slides, there are tons of resources. So please feel free to like take those slides, use those resources. And in fact, on the resource page, if I can get that to pull back up, we have several different lists. And I will tell you this master list here, I added to it yesterday. I add to it all the time. Whenever I find something, I'm like, oh, that's good. Let me grab that. So I do suggest just adding that. It's a Google Doc. Just add that to that shortcut to your drive, because I add to it often, and it's 23 pages now. So
and I know something was put that not everyone can see, but there was a question about, there's differences in screen reading versus written reading and sans serif. Like, what are the important differences? It's honestly, it's not like a definite. It's kind of like there's no right typeface, unfortunately. It's kind of, they're just saying that in printed format, sometimes it's easier with the tails to distinguish, but like it's more of a preference. It's just that you want to make sure that you're thinking about those other pieces of, is it parsed well? They're not too close together and they're not too far apart, so it's hard to distinguish the letters. It's also going to help your students with cognitive processing disorders and things like that too. So it's just being cognizant of what you're choosing more so than saying there's a right or a wrong one for either.
I'm trying to grab, there's a question in the chat about training. I'm trying to grab the one for WebAIM because that one's really good and cost effective, a lot more cost effective than the DQ one.
Pick them up for training.
Yeah. I think
okay.
Right link.
Yeah, and that one, I think technically the Excel part, it's for accessible documents. The Excel part is actually like an extra. It's like an add-on bonus. It's not even a required module, but they do it for PDFs. They do it for Word. They do it for Microsoft. So it is Microsoft specific. It is not Google, but it still translates in cases of like understanding the accessibility. You might just accomplish it slightly differently.
Yeah, I just know that the WebAIM one's a little bit cheaper. So I know
Yes.
if you've got very limited funds, maybe you're self-funding, that might be a better option for some people.
And you do get a certificate with the WebAIM one.
You totally
the
do.
The Q one, you do get certificates, but they're like per like segment that you complete. And they're usually associated with like CPACC, right?
I think.
Or IAAP. I can't remember which one. There are different certifications that they do training specifically for. So it's a little bit different because you're not actually getting certified in anything. You're not getting certified per se in webbing, but you get almost like I think you can actually pay to get CEUs on the ones for webbing, if I remember correctly, Chrystal.
I'll be honest, it's been a minute. I don't remember.
We don't use them that way, so I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are continuing education credit possibilities for the webbing one.
If you use a function in a cell, how does it get read by the screen reader? So it's gonna read that function. If you've typed in that equation, it is gonna read that out. It's gonna read out that macro.
Thank you so much. It does look like we are out of time, but thank you so much, Chrystal and Kristin. This has been wonderful. Y'all always do such a great job. And at this time, we are going to conclude our session. Our next concurrent session will begin at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can view the chat for session meeting room links, as well as access our conference website for a complete list of our concurrent sessions and their descriptions. And of course, while accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to our Hawks team. And while you're there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration to request your t-shirt and be entered into a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you will find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. So make sure you click on those coins to be entered to win an additional raffle. We'll see you at the next session. Thank you, everyone.